Welcome to NFL Live. A busy week of news continues today. Some reports out of Cleveland that make it very difficult to imagine the Browns and Myles Garrett working out a scenario to keep him. We're going to tell you all the latest on that. And the best player on Cincinnati's defense, Trey Hendrickson, has been granted his wish to find a trade partner. We'll tell you potential landing spots for him, plus the reason the Bengals didn't actually have to do this. And lots of quarterback-needy teams are looking to solve their problems in the next week in free agency and in the draft. Our analysts will place some quarterbacks on some teams they think make the most sense. Find out where we put Aaron Rodgers, Shedeur Sanders, and of course Sam Darnold. But we begin with the developing story on the Myles Garrett front. The defensive end officially requested a trade last month. New details emerging from the team today saying that there is a lack of relationship between ownership and Garrett in Cleveland. Jeremy Fowler's here with the latest to expound on this a lot more. What more can you tell us, Jeremy?
Well, Laura, sources have told me that the Browns are very dug in here, that they are comfortable getting uncomfortable with this situation if it drags out over weeks and months. And in fact, they have not gotten a ton of trade calls. They've gotten some. Certainly there's interest. But teams know it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to move Garrett at this point in time. Now, maybe there's some posturing involved or closer to the draft. This will intensify. But the Browns, they look like they're ready for this, for a fight, for a standoff. That's why Myles Garrett is trying to apply some pressure publicly with some various things you've seen at the Super Bowl, talking, a lot of leaks coming out. And so this is a power play that should shake out. There's going to be a ton of interest, no doubt. Part of the issue is the teams that want him or the teams that he wants to go to are contenders. They pick later in the first round, in the 20s, or maybe if you're Philadelphia, it's 32. That makes it difficult to put together the right kind of package that is going to move them off their spot. And
as you know, he said he wants to go to a contender, too. So it makes a ton of sense when it comes to potential destinations. Jeremy's with us all show long, so a lot more coming from him. Mina Kimes, Bill Barnwell joining us as well. Bill, let's start with you. What do you make of this situation in Cleveland?
There's just a major disconnect here between the entire Browns roster and what's happened financially since this Deshaun Watson contract. I mean, go back to last year. Joe Flacco outplays Deshaun Watson at the end of the season. Joe Flacco doesn't come back because the organization knew fans were going to be chanting for Joe Flacco the moment Deshaun Watson struggled in 2024. Watson's having one of the worst seasons in recent NFL history, 11th worst QBR since 2007. Early in the year, Kevin Stefanski comes in week out and says he gives us the best chance to win. I don't think Kevin Stefanski doesn't know what he's seeing on the field. The reality is they were locked into a contract they were not enjoying. And so from Myles Garrett's perspective, he's looking at this organization wondering, what's our plan forward? How do we start winning games? It feels like he's like the dog in the house on fire in the meme, and the Browns are saying everything is fine. It's not fine. It is a mess. And so I think from an ownership down perspective, a good organization will be getting Myles Garrett on board. What's the plan here? What's the role here? What are we doing at quarterback? It doesn't sound like that's happening here with the Cleveland Browns.
It's hard for me not to contrast what we're hearing about Myles and not meeting with the owner with what we see with Max Crosby in Vegas, who's another one of the best pass rushers in the NFL, who just signed an early extension. That's another team that hasn't had a ton of success at the quarterback position as of late, but they have made it very clear that Crosby is a part of this franchise moving forward. He's the face of the team. He is very involved, it feels like, in their decision-making process. And I completely agree with Bill. If I'm Myles Garrett, it's hard not to look at the choices that the team has made over the last few years at the most important position in football and not have skepticism about their path going forward. That said, it's also not hard to see why the Browns don't want to do this. It's not just because Myles Garrett is a generational player, future Hall of Famer, arguably the best defensive player in the NFL. You don't want to move on from players like that, even if you're rebuilding. Yeah. They would also be taking a sizable cap hit if they traded him, particularly if they trade him ahead of this draft. He's counting $36 million against the cap. I believe it's a $16 million hit. And there's questions about how big of a package they would get. Jeremy could probably speak to this better than I, but I haven't heard reports or rumors that a Khalil Mack-style trade with multiple firsts is on the table or being rumored about. So if I'm the Browns, I'm wondering, well, why would we do this unless the player's actually going to hold out?
Yeah, I mean, what's wild here is that the Cleveland Browns have no problems paying Myles Garrett, right? Like, that's not a money issue. He just wants out. As was told to me, he looks at this as like a Ferrari in a used parking lot a little bit. Like, he just feels like he needs to go where he's on a contender and they're not going to be close. I actually think the Browns will be, sneaky good next year potentially, but not at the level of some of these other teams that we're looking at. So that's the issue. They're willing to pay him, but this pass rush market is probably going to be at $40 million a year before we know it. That's the problem.
Good point. We've told this story before, but having him on Monday Night Football toward the latter part of the season last year, he told us he had met with ownership. He was trying to figure out what their plans were for the future so he could feel better about his future with the team. He didn't get the answers that he wanted. All right, let's go to the news that broke yesterday. Bengals star defensive end Trey Hendrickson has been granted permission to seek a trade. He was about the only bright spot on a defense that struggled mightily last season. They, of course, need to pay Jamar Chase and already placed the franchise tag on T. Higgins, trying to keep him too. It wasn't just that Hendrickson led the NFL in sacks last season, but he also created sacks for his teammates. Pretty wild. Using pass rush win rate, we can also determine how many total sacks a player creates for his team. Hendrickson's 26 sacks created in 2024 were by far the most by any player in a season over the last 5 years. Bill was bringing that point up yesterday. Just speaks to how great he is. Jeremy, what more can you tell us about the Bengals and their star defender? How did they get to this point?
Yeah, Laura, here's the deal. So Cincinnati came into March hoping to pay a trio of stars, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Trey Hendrickson, at least pay them eventually. So they did make a contract offer to Hendrickson. They tried. But given the pass rush market and where it's going, and Hendrickson wants a deal well above $30 million a year, Bengals couldn't quite get there commensurate with his skill set. So he said, look, in person, by the way, went into Cincinnati, met with the team, said, I'd like to be out. They at least entertained it. They're open to taking offers, fielding those, seeing what is best. Now, some teams I talked to believe that a first-round pick would definitely get it done, but maybe a day two package or, second-round pick and some change could get them to the finish line. Washington could make another move. They made the Deebo Samuel move. We'll see if they want to get a pass rusher. Atlanta could be lurking. I mean, there'll be some teams in the mix here for sure.
So the Bengals could have done this. I'll start here. They were capable, of paying Higgins, Chase, and Hendrickson. It would have required them to allocate a lot of cash to that, which is something they've been hesitant to do in the past. Yep. They could have gotten it done. It was entirely possible. It would have created a very top-heavy roster and required them to draft very well on defense, which is something they have not done in the past, but they had the ability to do so. Now, essentially choosing Higgins over Hendrickson, though I would argue it's kind of false to frame it purely that way because of their capability, they are completely rebuilding this defense from scratch. I mean, Hendrickson was really the only thing holding it together, barely, because we knew how bad they were last season. All of their pass rush has gone out the window. So they have to make the kinds of signings they did ahead of their Super Bowl season when they got Trey Hendrickson, and they have to draft well. And you know what? Good luck to them because it is going to be a tall order given what that roster looks like.
Okay, I don't disagree with anything Mina said, but I do think something I want to drill down on is the idea of a top-heavy roster. This would be almost unprecedented in the NFL. Think about what those four guys are going to get. Joe Burrow's already making $55 million a year. Jamar Chase, record-setting deal for a receiver, probably $37 million a year. If you're paying T. Higgins, you're thinking probably in the $30 million range. And now after that Max Crosby deal, Trey Hendrickson, up to $36 million a year. He's going to be setting the market on the edge. Doing the math in my head is going to be a little hard. I think that's about $158 million or so for four players. That's about 57% of the NFL salary cap. That's out of line with everybody else in football. Nobody else in the league right now is over 50%. The Eagles, who Joe Burrow brought up earlier this year, they're about 47% right now for their top four guys. So I understand the element of they could afford to pay them, and yes, they could structure the cap in such a way to get them all under the cap. But just in terms of your cash, that's a lot of money to pay for four players. You need to draft well underneath those guys, as Mina said, and they have not drafted well over the past few seasons.
It makes a ton of sense. All right, there's a lot more to dive into.
Đây nha mọi người, mình sẽ được một cái phần hình tròn màu hồng rất là xinh như này. Bây giờ móc tiếp hàng tiếp theo. Mọi người sẽ chuyển sang cái màu trắng cho mình nhé. Gỡ một chút len ra để sử dụng. Rồi bây giờ sẽ móc vào nhé. Mình móc vào. Sau đó siết chặt cái phần dây màu hồng. Rồi bây giờ sẽ móc cái phần màu trắng này lên nhé. Mình tiếp tục mình móc lên. Hàng tiếp theo này thì mình sẽ